Hello, Hans.
Hello, Michael. Be welcome. Nice that I can take part here with my Como. We always called it Como back then. The color motion Como. To see that live again and super.
Our Hans is or is still, I believe, the manager of this company, which now is named slightly different and has then experienced this live when back then the cube wall was produced, I think, and in production state. The number 2. Peter? Peter was deeply involved in the restoration of this cube wall, and is particularly now, with others involved in keeping it running, and everything doing that this thing is still functioning and so forth.
I have to say, I haven't been right from the very beginning thereby, but when I then got to know what it all was about here, I put all my heart and my soul into this project. I must say this right now. And I don't know how many of the little cubes I soldered. It's just part of it. And when you then follow the story of this great wall, it's really fun. And one thing I have to say straight away, all employees, especially our Eva and the workshop, in the museum, they had together, so super cooperation delivered, incredible. Without, it wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, exactly. And you already said, our third participant today, Eva Kudrass, curator from the Technik Museum for Informatics. And I'm particularly happy because Eva accompanied the project also from the side of the museum already right from the beginning, and therefore knows the details and then will make her contribution for telling the story again.
Yes, hello from my side too. I'm very glad that now also again for the third part I can contribute a little something. Ultimately, the whole project here only came about because many volunteers put lots of their spare time into the restoration, and because our restoration team was open enough to provide their really much support and simply permitted a lot of things to happen that would otherwise for historical objects not have been allowed. That was quite a stroke of luck. And that it has been running for such a long time and is now standing here in the entrance area of the museum makes me really happy. But the beginning was of course triggered by Mr. Heibges, who actually thought of letting the museum know and saying, we have something interesting there, maybe you want to add this to the collection.
Yes, for the last time it stood in the Ruhr-Park in Bochum, and there from 1992, 1999, it stood in the Ruhr-Park Bochum. This is a shopping center on the access road. After some years, everything was restructured finally, and then there was no room for it anymore. Then we had to think, with a very sad heart, we dismantled it and, put it into our hall. And then, in the meanwhile, the LED technology had advanced so much so that there was for the cube wall no longer any real intended use case available. Yes, what to do with the color motion. And in the very end, all sorts of museums have been contacted. And then finally, in the Technical Museum, our Eva, I think, advocated for it to come to Berlin, also partly caused by the fact that it has a relation to Berlin. Because it's I'll also send some little pictures as PDF. Here I have where it was in front of the ICC in Berlin standing. And that was for the Funkausstellung.
Okay, and how many of these things in total have been built?
This one here is the only one worldwide that had been built with this special housing shape. There were also 3 other models. One was in Barcelona, one has been in Paris, and one in Rome. And here, this was actually the prototype for a planned series. This was supposed to be a series then, but finally it ended up being with just that. And so, yes, this is also worldwide, the only one of this type that still exists now. Eva, also to you again, thank you. Yes, that you stood up for this. And that makes me happy. Yes, I am pleased that it is now there in the Museum of Technology and is attracting everyone's attention.
yes, this pleases me also. I have, of course, always to thank the people who even think of it before they finally scrap things to call here or in other museums. That there is the opportunity to exhibit something like this is simply thanks to all the various people who somehow think that they might perhaps have something interesting that the museum should perhaps keep in the long term. And that was with the color motion. I mean, when the call came and the first photos and the pictures from, yes, the ICC and the advertisements, I thought, yes, great, that's really a story that you don't necessarily see in the Technik Museum normally, namely those from public space, from the advertising displays that have been already in the big cities. Beginning of the 20th century, there were already Wanderschriften, also animated fonts that were then with electrically controlled light bulbs, nicely presented to the interested pedestrians. And especially in Berlin, at the Kudamm Eck, there was a very famous cube wall, let me say, 300 square meters in size, with hundreds of thousands of cubes that already had this 5 centimeters of edge length. And this is then for the Berliners a relative, well-known story, at least for the older, who then at the Kudamm walked along and where you in real time, news got presented and similar things. And the history of this object I also looked after, but there don't seem to be any remains of it at all. It was actually at a similar time in parallel to the color motion also, I think, until the 1990s in production. Then at some point it was damaged and dismantled and replaced with a large LED wall. In this respect, yes, this is simply something that is what you, when you normally show some home computers or also the history of large computers, something that is rather out of the way. That's why other museums may not have immediately reacted. I found it particularly exciting precisely because there is simply, on the subject of pixels, image point, a lot that can be didactically explained, where you somehow have a control technology with a modem, but also this, how is the public space real-time news? Here on color motion, there also were news or weather and the like has all been displayed already back then. At the same time, it is an advertising space. So it's also the commercial use, which with all the computer technology is always very much relevant, and therefore the intended use, which I simply found exciting.
And then you fell in love right from the start.
Exactly, that was always together with this, I wouldn't call it a condition, but actually linked with the challenge or the work item. You can only exhibit it here if it can be made operational again. And when Dietmar and I visited Hans back in 2017 and saw there that he still had an incredible amount of documentation material, the complete software, the original computer where it ran, the modems and so on, was clear to me. The conditions here are simply very good to make an object ready for operation again then, because that's of course the exciting part, that you also today can show things and that we can also use it as an information wall in the museum. If it wasn't running at all now, and was standing around in the depot, you wouldn't necessarily say that's spectacular. But in combination with the lucky guidance coincidence of finding people who would agree to do it again, getting it running, that was simply, that was simply a stroke of luck, I would say. This is often not so because actually, especially the whole documentation and also all the technical details, that is rarely kept by anyone for such a long period of time. That was, in this case, thanks Hans, everything was still compact and all the spare parts, everything that we can now use for repairs and for replacement during our daily maintenance work was simply there.
That was basically like on the serving tray, presented from Hans. Was the machine, when it arrived in its condition, somehow functional or was it damaged?
It was damaged. And our Peter Reichelt had that with his team, managed to bring it again into a good running state. Had many soldering points resoldered, had put new power supplies in there. That was really a big problem, and also the air conditioning because all those 12,800 cubes that are present with their little motors there generate, in fact, an enormous heat. We had also, in the Ruhr-Park, always constantly, problems that it got too warm again. And then again, one more technician had to drive there. Then at that time, Also, cubes got stopped occasionally. We had contact difficulties. And there I have to say that Peter and his team did a great job of making it for such a long time, run stable, and that day by day, as far as I can see it. I mean, there one have to say, hoot up.
Or even better, chapeau! Okay, we said it was going to the museum. The curator for informatics was thrilled, has taken it. And then finally came the contact to the working group Lebendige Technik. You probably had that in mind right away. Didn't you have that in mind from the beginning?
The very first attempt was made already at the Vintage Computing Festival 2017, where we presented the project quite short, or better, I together with a colleague presented the project. So we are looking for people who will take care about it and who might adopt it as a project in the end.
So was that.
A few people had already responded, but it was quite vague, and no one really dared to do it. And the cube wall had just arrived 2 or 3 weeks at the museum before. It was standing here already, and then I went with people from the Vintage Computing Festival to it. We looked at it, and afterwards, in the end, there was at least a little bit of general interest, but never really so that I thought, yes, now we can, from the feedback now, somehow knit a project. And then finally, Jan Weber, together with a few people, had already founded a group which were in principle committed in the museum to restore objects that could be made operable again, actually more in the communications technology, teleprinters and so on. And then I came across this crew, more or less, or Jan spoke to me. I don't even remember how exactly it went. In any case, I then realized, cool, that with this group that already exists in the museum, if we expand it further, then maybe we can tackle the project successfully. And then I had a few of the interested parties who came from the Vintage Computing Festival, quickly forwarded to Jan Weber and Peter and Detlef and everyone who already have been active there. And so it gradually formed then at the beginning of 2018. And they were actually relatively stable together until the cube wall finally could be erected here at the end of 2020 in the museum. Indeed, they walked this long path together that you then had to go to get the thing working again in the end. The great thing was, when we picked it up from Hans, the last picture was frozen. It still had Ruhr-Park.
Yes, that was nice.
Standing there, which means we had some rough idea of what it might look like later. I think that was pretty good.
So you brought, so to say, a frozen image from the past to the museum finally.
Exactly. Yes, from the Ruhr-Park, that was, standing still there.
That's almost archaeology then.
Yes, indeed.
I think it would have been more difficult if it had just been a white cube wall to get people excited about it, because it was like, oh, you got the idea.
You could show it and say, this is what it's going to look like. There was actually a picture and stuff, and then they took a bite.
Yeah, and we also had videos. Hans also had from the company in the Netherlands a video recording of how it back then with the original looked like there. And all such things are, of course, really, really important to motivate people at all that it could be fun or the result might be great. Yeah. Exactly, and that's how this group finally was formed here in the museum, which, relatively independent of me, actually carried out the entire project, mostly together with the restorers here in the house.
So Arjan, at just the right time, had founded the group here, fortunately.
John actually guided us well. I really have to claim that. And I always used to say, let them talk first. Get to the soldering iron, and then it started. And then we began with a small so-called demo wall first. That means we didn't start with the 50 modules that actually belonged to the original wall, but instead we first worked with only 3x3 modules, and initially made them functional again. And already there, on this matrix, we were able to display images, and we even were able to present those at the Maker Faire. This was very well received by the kids especially. We've already taken this. So far, Jan has written a little Python script for us. They will definitely get to that later, for sure. And this Python script was able already to push images from a bitmap directly via the serial interface onto the wall then. It was only the small wall, but you could already recognize faces quite clearly. That means we put all the kids there in front of the camera then, and afterwards we simply pushed all these pictures over to the wall. That was really fascinating and all. The kids were, of course, thrilled. The people could also make drawings, any colorful images, and then found themselves back on the wall. And that, of course, interactively, we actually want to do this soon in a similar way. Again.
Yes.
Yeah, the location in the FEZ, in the Leisure and Recreation Center in Berlin, that was a really good option. The lucky coincidence that we got one stand there and could actually show the deep innards of the color motion in detail, and everyone could use it on their own, was ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Then came the transport.
The transport, exactly.
The large wall was temporarily stored, which was on the second floor. Right, on the second floor. And there we had the opportunity to build. The assemblies could be repaired, modules could be completed, and done. Then in the end, it was moved again from this place to this current location. That was really a big adventure, I have to say. We first had to remove all assemblies, all modules together completely, so that it gets lighter and also transportable, and the delicate cubes wouldn't break during the procedure by accident. Therefore, first everything was dismantled, and then the system was transported across the yard, first with the crane down from the floor, then afterwards completely through the whole big building, and then finally across the yard to the actual location. Well, what all other things happened there? Because the big weight comes into play.
The weight, yes. What is it again?
1.6 tons.
1.6 tons, and there was a problem with the... there was a little problem with the funny forklift. The forklift put the wall halfway up, and then it wouldn't go further anymore. It didn't go further anymore. The forklift just said finished.
It's way too heavy for me.
And then at the end, in total, 3 forklifts were used. Even the ceiling still needed to be reinforced. Well, we were really lucky that was during Corona time, and we were really lucky that there were no spectators here. Therefore, we were able to bring it up peacefully. And the employees who were also there, they were also so committed there. Eva, you perhaps can say again who all was involved.
Yes, Dietmar, Ruppert, especially with his team from the depot. They did here on all the transports as they made it before. Also from Gelsenkirchen to Berlin. All has already been attended and planned. Then over the balconies into this setup room where we could work. Then again back over the balcony, so to speak, to the outside with the crane. This is very complex for such a large object. I mean, for sure, the Technik museums are, of course, in principle, generally also suitable for larger object transporting. And Dietmar is there, very committed, but actually it was really centimeter work. So at short notice, we had to clear away objects that were in the way, and a plane had to be removed.
Right.
Clear away another airplane.
The Cessna.
And so on. Exactly. So it was in fact quite complex.
Sounds like an adventure.
Then Dietmar asked me quickly to remove the ventilator here. You can see it here on the side. It still had to be dismantled before. It was really millimeter work. There the Cessna was still hanging on the ceiling, and it really went by hair. You can see it in our movie.
One can imagine that, indeed.
Yes, and then stood the wall here, and of course had to be filled then. Beforehand, we checked all the assemblies again, completed them. And then the individual modules were pushed in here. Yes, that was a really lovely fun.
How long did it take until it was working?
In one day, I actually got all the modules in there, I think, and then it was running already.
That was for sure a nice moment, too.
Yes.
Did you have champagne with you?
Much alcohol was not there, to be honest.
But really, wasn't that somehow an emotional moment?
Yes.
Good.
You can say that.
Yes, and now it's here, the cube wall. And it works.
And the funny thing is, we always don't know if it depends on the temperature, actually. At the moment, we obviously have the right temperature. The wall feels really comfortable. I sense that. This noise that you can hear right now shows that the wall is on, that the power is on. This means that the power supplies are all in operation, and you can hear the fans of the power supplies a little bit. That's why this background noise is added here.
Yeah.
I have then, so that you can use it simple nicely, easy simple going. I have simply a remote control that has in total only 4 buttons where you actually can simply switch the light on and off easily.
Cool, the light is off now.
Wait, that's handy.
We also have to show Hans the demonstration. I will move my laptop.
Then we also have interior lighting. Maybe you won't see this now, I don't know.
Interior lighting, yes. Up there, for example. For the technicians.
So that when you walk in, also can see. Well, in the meantime, the tubes have been replaced. I think we now have LED tubes there. Then I can turn off the wall, more precisely power off. So now it becomes quiet.
Now it becomes calm.
And now we can speak without this background noise at last.
Yay!
And then I have a button where the computer just simply can easily start up or shut down.
Maybe we can just briefly, now I see this picture, insert a little Technic episode right now. While we're at it. Why is power off so important?
Yes, well, Arjan had in the second video back then already a lot of Technic explained. And I thought to myself, perhaps better use power on, power off. Try to use as sparingly as possible to make sure that it's not always power on there. The power goes through all of the entire cubes, and thereby it heats up. We there sometimes get over 50 degrees, and if the outside temperature gets higher, and we don't have climate technique we can't operate here in the room. This was outside, of course. In the field, there it was important, since in summer heat and in the winter, in the cold. Now we don't need the air conditioning anymore and have to see how we can cope with the heat in the end. To get around that, 3 new radial ventilators were newly installed, which now circulate everything again from below. But inside the housing, then we have the option to issue in the script power off commands. This means that the motors all switch off and the performance is reduced. So in the script, power off, power on, power off, power on.
That it doesn't get so hot. And when power on is enabled, you explained, that wasn't really clear to me either with these coils from the motors. Because such a motor actually has 4 coils, I think.
That is a very simple motor that has 4 windings. Depending on which winding gets current, the cube rotates due to the magnetic field and shows the color red, green, blue, or white.
Exactly. This is really a brilliant technology. I wasn't even aware. Current comes on, one of the windings gets control and creates a magnet field, and then pulls itself to the corresponding next magnet.
Correct. So it can happen that sometimes 2 colors are skipped, of course, and it's not quite as exact, but in principle it keeps going well.
So in principle the magnet is attracted, and if it then is hanging there, you can do power off because afterwards it won't move anymore. Then you can simply switch it off and it will stay like that.
Yes, if you don't push the wall too much and it stands quite well.
It stands quite well with its 1.6 tons.
Correct.
This is a really big thing. You had mentioned that you already had at the Maker Faire a solution where you can then display images directly. And I would like to talk about the 3 that are at least known to me. 3 designs. Let's briefly discuss how you get such pictures on the wall. The original solution, and Hans, you probably know it also, is Dr. Hallow is called the program.
Exactly, Dr. Hallow was that.
A drawing program where you can paint pictures.
But the solution with the scanner, I think, was still before that, because it is very laborious with Dr. Harlow.
So Hans, then the first solution, very briefly.
Yes, that was a handheld scanner, but we no longer had it. And back then there was this Dr. Harlow was with this hand scanner included.
So the hand scanner was already part of it. With that, you could put your own pictures into the Dr. Harlow, probably.
Yes, exactly. So it was.
What I know is only Dr. Harlow, where you can just paint. That's how they started, probably, and also your team.
But Dr. Harlow, pixel by pixel. There is the possibility in Dr. Harlow already to draw some little figures, also some dimensioning, and add texts finally then. That's the quite primitive way with Dr. Harlow, but it works okay.
And then at the end we get an image file as output with the format pic, PIC.
Derived somehow from the CGI format of the former graphic cards, where simply the contents of the graphics card could be adopted.
Exactly, that's it. In the image file, is basically the graphics card memory of a CGI graphics card that can display 4 colors. And this PIC file can then finally be read by the Como software. And the Como software then transports this into a serial bit stream in the end, which our John then had analyzed back then. And then the bits are pushed into the wall. So that was the original solution. With that you worked with for a long time.
I would call it the third solution, was using a small Raspi to create a Python script, which Jan already managed to do quite well. With that, we used it at the Maker Faire back in 2019.
Exactly. So that was the third solution. After the scanner solution is known, the third solution, which our John implemented then. He had in principle the PC replaced with a Raspi.
Okay.
And had the RASP, and had the protocol, the serial protocol, that goes to the cube wall then re-engineered. And he made really sure that the Raspi sends the same bits as the PC used to send.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And then he had the big advantage that on the Raspi Python was running and could be executed. And Python can simply read the normal image formats already. And therefore, BMP, GIF, and JPEG could then be projected onto the cube wall.
And now we have the fourth solution, and now Michael comes into play.
This is now my third encounter with the cube wall. I have then, because I was here now, and also with our Eva had discussed that we would make a video. My idea was to show some pictures on the wall, or better photos, that they were able to do before, but is currently not working, how they implemented it, as it is just here. And then Peter sent me then sample files, fortunately, namely these PIC files and a bit of a short explanation to this. And then I also re-engineered it. And now there's a solution that we, basically, again, with a little Python script, from normal images, for example, GIF, BMP, JPEG, we can create this Pic-Format, PIC format, and we can then simply copy it as it is to the PC via the USB stick. What we did just before in preparation. And then at the end you see this. This graphic. On the right, this should be the cube wall. In the middle is the IBM PC to which we copied it, that then via a serial line transfers it to the cube wall. And at the very front is my Mac, where I created with Gimp the JPEG and then converted to the PIC format. Very briefly explained. Technic part finished. Hans, still time and energy left?
Sure, yes.
Yes, I still have questions. How much did the wall cost? Anyone knows that?
Yes, that cost back then 128,000 guilders.
Guilders?
Guilders.
Interesting.
For that you have to know some details. Textlight was founded in Holland, and I back then took over the sales personally, general sales for Germany, and Textlight Holland then developed other types of products. And some years later, had to be liquidated then finally. And then afterwards, I started my own product development then, also still under the old branding, Textlight.
Hans, the wall has cost 125,000 guilders.
128,000 guilders.
128,000 guilders. And how much did a script cost now?
Oh yes, that's where it was in the Ruhr-Park then. I have to be honest. I don't even remember. Those were... The price list you still should have somewhere around.
Yes, we have it. We can have a look at it.
I don't know it by heart anymore.
What did you charge customers for the service finally?
Exactly.
Well, in the end, it had to pay for itself again somehow. And therefore, of course, for the advertising space. You had to pay a lot of money. And back then, for that time, here, so illuminated, interactive and animated, that was a very attractive advertising space in this respect. I also don't have the exact costs in mind, but of course it was more expensive than hanging somewhere a poster, sure.
That had to be more expensive, sure.
At these initial costs.
I still remember that back then I also had an advertising agency from Essen that for the first brochure and also this price list did the design. They have, if I remember right, it was around 20,000. The D-Mark, which they then at the time, they also pocketed just to develop the concept for me finally. That really was somehow, and the whole transport and the setup. So there were a lot of things that led to some additional costs that were incurred there, also having to go there again and again, because there were technical problems occurring, also especially with the climate system. I also had that to completely renewed at once. It was also a little dime grave, you could say.
So you haven't earned much.
I mean, money, in fact. I actually never made with it.
Oh no.
But I was so much in love with this beautiful thing, where I saw it for the first time in Holland, and also saw the development there in deep detail. Then I was just simply fascinated. And yes, I bought it actually on the beer mat back then, in beer mood at night. Yes, with...
Oh, really?
Yes, really, with the other Tex Light founders back then, who now no longer exist.
And the next day, felt a little bit guilty then?
No, actually not. I was also happy that the thing was mine, finally, because whenever I came to Holland back then, into the factory, it was running there, and I was always really thrilled then. And especially now, where it finally has such a place of honor, gives me an inner satisfaction.
Technically, I can add something else. In addition to the heat problem, I can also say that the fluorescent tubes that were in there, they still work also now. I can switch immediately if I want, but they generate a lot of heat there. The transformers that are there, the electric ballasts, we have replaced them with LED technique. And it's just as good, I would say.
Exactly. But it's always a matter of weighing which of the parts you replace, which old things you continue to use still, and at which places you simply make some compromises then, or you say that the newer technology is now much more energy efficient and much more practical for our use case, which is why we actually replaced it then. With all these different technical ways, there were also discussions within the group which way we should go then. So do we now use Raspi, or do we keep the old computer with all the old software that is still running on it? Exactly. These discussions are then always productive, of course, within the group, but also difficult to resolve because there is no silver bullet way, and there are always other people who sometimes have a say, like the restorers, for example, who have also an opinion. That's why I'm glad that we've managed it finally over this very long time frame. The machine get to run so stably in the end. Also that, I mean, the handover here in House to the people who make demonstrations, who day by day turn it on and off, who are also totally in love. I mean, that wasn't also not so clear to me after all. How should that all function if the whole group here, the working group, Lebendige Technik here, no longer every day shows up, and that, yes, must somehow be transferred to the museum. And that was simply the really big advantage, because there was, from Peter, this little remote control, for example, a very simple, really simple method where even people who perhaps don't have much knowledge of computer technique were able to start it autonomous. And there are also among the people who give demonstrations here, many interested who also want, to develop this further and are interested in it. Exactly. So that's also what you have to keep in mind, that with everything you exhibit here, then all the people in-house somehow pick up. And this has worked quite well in this case.
Sure, yes.
Regarding the thermal problem, I can tell you a bit more. The logic boards have all a voltage regulator there. Originally, it was a really very simple, small analog voltage regulator, where I thought I replaced that now with a tiny digital regulator, and guess what? Temperature has dropped noticeably. I haven't replaced all the logic boards with it yet, but as long as it's going so well now, I perhaps better won't touch it. But it made a big difference. We had sometimes over 55 degrees in there, and if when you measure exactly above the assembly then and above the voltage regulator, you can really notice the big difference. More than 30 degrees don't come down there anymore, so they actually stay cold. And therefore, of course, such a voltage regulator, digitally controlled, significantly better.
Mm-hmm. And how many have you already fixed?
Definitely the half.
The half.
But there was a little problem. The voltage regulator generates a magnet field. The magnet field influences the modem, and the modem then no longer works. So I had to think about, what are you going to do now? A small shielding on the voltage regulator wasn't the right thing either. We have found out that the voltage regulator has to be exactly at an angle of 45 degrees finally.
Because of the magnetic field.
So tiny things, yes. that back then you didn't have to take into account. But well, yes.
That is then the disadvantage of digital technology. Yes, also intriguing.
Yes, a lot of the work is simply trial and error.
Yes.
Tinkering.
Tinker, and then think further, and then think in other directions again. And ultimately, lives the project from the fact that we keep pushing in different
Lebendige
directions.
Technik.
Yes, living technology.
Therefore, also our group, Lebendige Technik. That had Jan already founded that way, and I find that really good, yes. There we come close to that thing, what we all do here.
Exactly. All the visitors and customers are simply fascinated, stand in front of it, ask questions, look at the site, wonder what kind of a dinosaur technique is that.
Exactly. For that, also a glass door.
Exactly. They think it's funny that there are such pixel errors. That can't be right at all. And if you then explain to them that what they see on their smartphones is actually also only a pixel image, only much smaller, that is then for sure also a learn effect that I think is quite good.
Yes, I have definitely learned many things about or through the cube wall also. And yes, let's see what happens next with the project and with Lebendige Technik. You still search for people?
Yes, clear. Sure. Especially young talent is difficult to get.
Then we'll put out another call for all young people who would like to tinker with the living technology here in the Technik Museum. Final word from Hans.
Many greetings to the Como, and for a long lifetime, and many thanks for the interview. Michael, Eva, thanks again. Peter and the whole team, all the best. Have a nice day, and see you back soon. Cheers.
Thank you, we'll pass that on.
Bye.
See you.
Yeah, see you. Tschüss.